Always heartening to me when I see groups of people who care enough to come together and listen about people talking about these important sorts of issues. So I very much appreciate the chance to come and speak about it. As Joel said, my name is Raphael Ramos. I'm the Director of Legal Action of Wisconsin's Eviction Defense Project. Just by way of background, Legal Action of Wisconsin is a nonprofit law firm that provides civil legal aid to low-income tenants in Milwaukee. We've been in operation since 1968, and at the beginning of this year, we launched our Eviction Defense Project in the Milwaukee County Courthouse. That project provides free legal assistance to tenants, to low-income tenants who are actually being evicted from their homes. Because we are in the courthouse, we're able to do more than what clinical programs are typically able to do, which is just provide advice. Because we're in the courthouse, we're actually able to meet with tenants, give them advice, but also negotiate with the landlords when it's appropriate to try to work something out, to try to ensure long-term housing stability, and to also provide legal representation when it's not appropriate to actually work something out at that time, to give tenants a fair opportunity in court to have their case heard. Our project is open generally on Mondays and Thursdays, and we also float between certain Wednesdays and Fridays. So if you know anyone who needs legal assistance with an eviction, we're there in the afternoon on those days, so please feel free and send them our way. Tonight I'm going to talk and try to tie together the idea of eviction with the affordable housing crisis and the issues people have accessing affordable housing in Milwaukee. First, I'll just kind of talk about the eviction epidemic in our city. For those of you who don't know, it's a huge problem. Joel mentioned it earlier, but if you've not read it, Professor Matthew Desmond at Princeton published a book in 2016 called Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. It's a tremendous read, and I really urge all of you to take a look. It paints a very realistic and depressing picture of what it's like to live in Milwaukee when you're poor, when you're trying to rent, and when you have evictions on your record. What's most interesting about that book is that he did the research in Milwaukee. So the stories you read, the stories you're hearing are happening here. They're happening in our community, and they're happening every day. And that's what our project was designed to do, was designed to help people in those circumstances. So I'll talk about the eviction epidemic. I'll talk about the project, talk about what we do, which I've done already to some degree. But then I'll also talk about eviction generally and what sort of impact it can have on low-income people when they're trying to find a place to live, when really they're just trying to make it day to day and something comes along that can really, quite literally, derail the rest of their life. So affordable housing, when you look at the HUD definition, what they say is families who pay more than 30% of their income for housing are considered cost-burdened and may have difficulty affording necessities such as food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. That's 30% of your income for housing. When you look at a lot of low-income Milwaukee tenants, this is something that Matthew Desmond pointed out in eviction, is people are paying upwards of 70, 80% of their income to rent. So how can you survive when that's the sort of number that you're paying just to rent? When the choice comes between clothing your kids, paying for food, paying for an emergency medical visit, trying to find money because you missed 2 days of work, but you only make so much and 80% of your money goes to rent, what do? Those sorts of figures put a lot of people at risk of eviction. And in 2016, there were more than 13,000 evictions filed in Milwaukee. 13,000. You take that number and you multiply it by the average rental household size in Milwaukee, and you're looking at approximately 32,000 people per year who are evicted by eviction filings. So it's a huge problem. It's a tremendous problem. One thing that exacerbates that problem and makes it worse is that when they get to court, if they go to court, if they believe they have a chance, when they get to court, we have found that there's a justice gap. There's an issue of representation and fairness. Again, in 2016, if you look at the numbers on CCAP, what you see is that slightly more than 50% of landlords had legal representation, had attorneys there advocating their case. If you look at the number of tenants who had representation, it's less than 1%. Out of 13,476 cases filed, 112 tenants had an attorney. And that's just not enough. It's just not fair. I hear some people say, well, that's too bad, they should get an attorney. Well, it's not that easy. There's not that much nonprofit free legal resources available to people as tenants. And landlords are fortunate in that the majority, as these numbers clearly indicate, have the ability, have the choice on whether they want to hire an attorney or not. If you're low income, you can't afford an attorney. Legal Action has one full-time housing attorney. Legal Aid has, I believe, 2. And we're the 2 largest nonprofit civil legal aid providers in the city. So to get access is difficult. And that's one of the reasons why we created the project, the Eviction Defense Project. Again, when you look at eviction filings per year, it's just on an upward curve. In 2012, it was slightly less than 13,000 evictions per year. By 2016, it was almost 13,500, and it's on an upward trend. When you look at our population in Milwaukee, our population is slightly less than 1 million people. 20% live in poverty. That's all from U.S. Census data and CCAP for the court stats. So when you're looking at that level of poverty and trying to figure out how they're impacted by evictions, yes, a lot of evictions are rooted in allegations that the tenants failed to pay. What you often see, though, is that first and foremost, that failure to pay is often just tied to poverty. It's just they don't have the money to make it because they're paying so much for rent, and that's competing with other things. And as Desmond says, rent eats first. You have to pay it first, otherwise you expose yourself to eviction. What we also see, though, is that oftentimes that failure to pay is tied to conditions issues at the property. You're talking about properties that have roach infestations and mold problems. So there are serious issues at these properties that make them not worth it in the mind for the tenant to pay what they're being asked. And the way Milwaukee's laws are set up is that it's possible to reduce the amount that you're paying. It's called rent abatement. But it's a very tricky process, and you really have to do it correctly. And if you're doing it on your own, if you're not going to community advocates for help, or you're not talking to a lawyer, you can do it wrong. And when you do that, you expose yourself to the risk of eviction. Again, in Milwaukee, 1 out of 8 renters are forced with an involuntary move every 8 years. So it's a significant problem in our city. Again, the Eviction Defense Project was created to help address these issues in court. Desmond, he recommended a bunch of different solutions. One of the things he suggested was increased legal representation, which is what we try to provide. Other states do a lot of this already. They have legal representation, or they have other avenues designed to make it easier for tenants to find a way to stay in their homes. New York, very excitingly, just a few months ago, established a right to counsel for people being evicted. We don't have that here. Washington, D.C. has what's called the right to redemption, where if they can make a landlord whole, if they can pay the past due rent, and they can pay the court costs, regardless of when they do it, if they do it before they're evicted, they can stay there. We don't have that here. Here, if you don't cure within 5 days or some other period, the landlord can kick you out. They can have you removed. And we see it a lot. We see tenants come to us and say, hey, I paid already, but they paid after the suit's been filed, or they paid in some other circumstances where it doesn't matter. The landlord can take their money and still evict them. Again, these issues are issues that can be addressed, but a lot of tenants don't know how to deal with them, which is why we created the project. So again, the Eviction Defense Project, it's a free, volunteer-based project. We're funded by a federal grant from the Legal Services Corporation. It's a 2-year grant, so we're moving into year 2, actually beginning this month. And then we're hoping to get additional funding from LSC and other sources as the project progresses. We have been fortunate to have a lot of community support to make it possible, not just from LSC, but from other organizations in the city. Again, the idea behind the project is that there's very few legal resources in the city. So what we've been able to do is provide legal representation by using pro bono volunteer attorneys. Those volunteers have allowed us to, this year alone, provide legal assistance to almost 450 unique clients. So the year's not even over, and we've already quadrupled the rate of representation for tenants. That's great, but it's still nowhere near enough. Just generally, this is a picture of the eviction process and what it looks like. You have to get notice before you're evicted. The notice has to expire. The landlord can file for eviction. It's a very lengthy, drawn-out process, and it's a very strict process. And a lot of tenants, a lot of landlords, frankly, don't know how it works, and mistakes are made. If a tenant's unrepresented, they may not know that they have a defense to an eviction that could give them more time at a place to find a place to live, or give them some leverage to negotiate with the landlord to work something out that works for both of them long term so they can improve their housing stability. What I want to focus on here is right here, the filing of the summons and complaint, the actual eviction filing, and this is where I'll kind of try to tie it back to the affordable housing issues we talked about before. One of the issues is that in terms of affordable housing in Milwaukee, there isn't enough. You know, James mentioned it, there aren't enough vouchers, there aren't enough places where you can stay and pay an amount that's actually reasonable, that's within your means. One thing that makes that more challenging is the fact that when an eviction is filed, as soon as an eviction is filed, a court record is created. CCAP is the Wisconsin Circuit Court online database. It's publicly accessible. And landlords use this database to research potential tenants to see what's going on with their history. As soon as a court case is filed, regardless of outcome, when it's filed as an eviction, it shows up in that database as an eviction case against a tenant. And what we've seen, what we know, is that a lot of landlords will not, rent to tenants who have an eviction on their record. A lot of other landlords will not rent to tenants who have an eviction filing on the record, even if that eviction has been dismissed. So even in cases where the eviction should never have been filed and the case was dismissed, it still shows up on CCAP. It still shows up on the record. If you click into it, yeah, it says dismissed, but a lot of landlords don't care about that. It doesn't matter. So that right there is a barrier to people finding housing, finding a place to live. Other landlords will take advantage of the fact that a person's been evicted because they know they don't have very many options. They know they don't have a place to go. Lots of clients come to us and tell us that they have been asked to pay a double security deposit for their first month's rent. That's great that they're finding a place to stay, but that cost, that initial upfront cost, puts a lot of tenants who are already struggling with finances in a very tenuous financial position, because you're putting up this huge outlay of cash in the beginning, and any misstep, any accident, any problem can lead you to find yourself facing an eviction because you fell behind. So the other issue with eviction judgments, and this was mentioned on one of Jim's slides, is that if an eviction is granted against a tenant, that eviction precludes you from a lot of government assistance for affordable housing. So when you have an eviction on your record, not only is it harder to find a place with the landlords, but it's harder to find assistance to let you find a place to live. So it's an incredibly difficult situation that really puts people on a downward spiral of housing instability. Those CCAP records stay online for 20 years. 20 years. I'll go fast now because I'm running out of time. At the project, and just generally, people should know that it is possible to have those CCAP records sealed. You can have them removed. There are circumstances and thresholds that have to be met. In order to seal, the court has to know that the case basically should not have been filed. The court's going to look and they're going to balance the public's valid interest in access to information against the interest in privacy and the harm that's going to come to the individual because of that information release. That is generally only going to be possible when the case has been dismissed. The court's going to look at, again, some sort of procedural or substantive error. Tenants need to know that that is an option, because we see a lot of tenants come through, have their case dismissed, but then they don't get the CCAP seal. So they still face those same challenges in finding a place to live. Again, just evictions and affordable housing, the two kind of lead to a cycle where lack of affordable housing puts someone in a position where they're evicted. When they're evicted, they can't access affordable housing, so they pay more for a place that's not worth it, and they find themselves evicted again. It goes over and over. So it's a huge problem in the city. We're trying our best to stop it, but all the work here that's being done tonight is very important because these are real big issues for our city. So, thank you.